Our message will be from Exodus, if you want to look that up. Chapter 32. 32, 1 to 14. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off your rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives and sons and daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a carving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are the gods of Israel who brought you out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down to your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt. Whom you have brought out of the land have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are our gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that they may make a nation for you.' But Moses implored the Lord, his God, and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, what evil intent did he bring them down out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Isaac and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised. And I will give to you offspring, and thou shalt inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of, bringing to his people." This is the word of the Lord.
Hello everyone, is that working? Sounds good. Well, good morning. John messaged me on about Wednesday to ask me to preach this, and so I figured, as I was saying to the others, natural stepping point from Galatians is clearly Exodus, so for those of you who might not know, I'm currently in Bible college. I'm in about my third year, and last year, for one of my subjects, we had to write a 10-minute sermon on a piece of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, on a passage from there, and the one I was given was Exodus 32. I shortened it down a little bit. So this is, I've added a bit, but I still don't know how long it's going to take, so you guys might get an early minute or you might be here a bit later. We will see. But first, let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you that you have given your word and have been faithful to your people over so many generations, even when it doesn't look like it, even when we turn away, you are still faithful. Lord, I pray that as I speak, that that your words would be, that you would be speaking through me, that I'll be speaking your words, not my own, and that this would bring you glory and edify your church. In Jesus' name, amen. So, the story of the golden calf, I think, is one that most of us have probably heard at least in Sunday school, if not elsewhere. It's a fairly, from just the outset, it's not a good look for the people of Israel. It's one of the big sins. It's one of the ones that is recalled time and time again. When the people fail, when they stumble, all the way up through when they've established themselves in the land as a kingdom, this is the one that it keeps coming back to. And so, some backstory then. So God has saved his people. His people have been in the land in the land of Egypt for 430 years, and most of that as slaves. And so, as we all know, in the story of the Passover, God frees his people. He sends Moses as his prophet to stand against Pharaoh and to release his people from their bondage. So they've walked through the Red Sea at God's command, and they've been wandering in the Sinai desert. And not too long goes by before they start to complain. They start to say, we're hungry, we're tired, we want to go back to Egypt. At least we knew what we were getting there. Now we're out here, we don't know where our next meal's coming from. And still, after all their complaining, God sends manna from heaven. He sends quail for them to go and collect up to provide for his people. And even when it's given, they still disobey. He says, collect extra on the 6th day for the Sabbath, but apart from that, do not. Otherwise, it will just disappear and go rotten by the next day. And they still try their best to circumvent God's rules. And eventually, they come to Mount Sinai. They come to rest at Mount Sinai and set up camp there. And God speaks to them from the cloud at the base of the mountain. Whether it's through Moses or not, we don't know, but he speaks to them and he gives them the law. And they swear the covenant with him. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And on this basis, he gives them the law. It's not they do the law and then he saves them. He saves them, and as a privilege, he gives them the law to be in covenant relationship with them. And then, once he's given the law, Moses goes up the mountain to hear from God, to speak with him personally, and to write down everything that God has said to them. So, by the time we reach the beginning of chapter 32, Moses has been up there for 40 days and 40 nights, little bit over a month. And the Israelites are getting pretty frustrated. They've reached their boiling point. They haven't had a sign for over a month, and they're impatient for another one. And so they come to Aaron and they say, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, this man who's brought us out of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him." So already they're distrusting. Already they've lost faith. They want to go into the promised land. They want a land of their own, but which one's going to do it for them? God said, "I am the Lord your God." And then in verse 4, you see that mirrored with, "These are your gods who brought you out of Egypt." And so Aaron says, "Take off your ring, take off your earrings, take off all the gold and jewelry, and bring them to me." And they all did so and brought it to him. And he took the gold and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf, and says, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Or, that's the interesting part. The calf seems like an obvious misstep. Like, how do you mistake a golden calf for, like, it's a gold statue. It's not breathing, it's not talking, it's not doing anything. It's a statue. But when you actually look at it, the Israelites wanted something tangible to worship. That's clear. So Aaron, he's clearly a skilled like metalsmith. That's probably why he was the one to do it. And so Aaron cooked up the first thing that fit what they wanted. It's messy Hebrew, but because gods, you can interpret that either way. The word is same plural or singular. It could be, "This is your God," or "These are your gods." Because the bull was, in the context of Egypt, of Assyria, of all the nations at that time, it's not necessarily God in and of itself. It can be a throne, it can be a pedestal for the god to stand on, it can be, it's not necessarily saying that they were worshipping something other than Yahweh. It's very possible that they were just trying to worship Yahweh, but in a totally perverse and wrong way. They don't go towards the Baals or the Asherahs. And Aaron even says, when he builds the altar before it, he makes the proclamation, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." At the very least, this is what he thinks. He thinks that whatever he's done, this will somehow slide. This is just, they needed something, and this will like placate them until Moses gets back and we can sort all this out. But the problem is, as much as it's easy to go either way, they still broke the law. We can't give them enough, get them out of it because Moses hasn't brought the tablets down. One of the first laws that God gave when he spoke to them out of the mountain was, "You shall not have any graven images." Doesn't matter whether they're for him or for something else. God knows how he wants to be worshipped. God has, and as they speak, in the chapter just earlier, God is in the middle of setting out how he wants the tabernacle to be built. He sets aside two people, says these ones will be the ones who will take all the gold, all the jewelry that I procured for you through the Egyptians, and they will melt it down and make an altar pleasing for me. Because they didn't get the gold earrings for themselves. They were slaves. You don't generally have wealth to just hanging about in jewelry and stuff if you're a slave doing hard labor in the middle of Egypt. In Exodus 12, eventually. In Exodus 12 we read, "During the night Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, 'Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said and go, and also bless me.'" This is just after God has struck down all the newborns of Egypt, all the firstborns of Egypt. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave, for otherwise we will all die, they said. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in cloth. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. This gold was not theirs to use as they desired. This was not theirs to make a decision on. This was God's gift, and they decided to make their own decision, to make their own altar without his permission. As I said, not 2 chapters earlier, we see God making... Still working? Cool. We see God making provisions for that. He's designed the tabernacle down to the letter, each dimension. He's got this figured out. But they don't wait for God's provision to honour him properly. They want to do it on their own terms. So, once the bull is complete, they have a party. They've had a great accomplishment. Everything's good. They've made an altar. They've apparently made an altar to the Lord, and they ate, drank, and rose up to play. Now, play is from my limited understanding of Hebrew and from class, it's the family-friendly term for it. Sahak is the term, and it's in this form it's generally loaded. While its roots are the same as the name Isaac, the patriarch, which is to laugh. The only other time you see it in this form is in the story of Potiphar's wife with Joseph, where she accuses Joseph and says that he has come to make sport of us. And so you can imagine what the Israelites are doing then in this desert. They're eating and drinking, they're having a great time, they're partying it up, and just from the sounds of things being generally licentious. And so they first build a calf and say, "This is Yahweh." Then they just worship him like every other nation. They worship him like every other nation does, by getting drunk and doing all the things that every other nation does for their gods. They were told specifically to use an altar of earth in the meantime while God set up the tabernacle in Exodus 20. But again, they wanted it their way. They wanted to do things how they'd learned to do it in Egypt. God wanted a people who were separate, kingdom of priests. He wanted people who would be a light to the nations, that they would see the difference in the people of God, and that they would be drawn to that. And instead, what they do is they act just like everyone else. They don't take God's wishes into account. They just do what they want. Eden is an unreachable memory at this point, but the law was supposed to bring them as close as they got, but they didn't care. So, God sees this. He sees everything they're doing. He sees all the corruption that's taken place in the camp, and he says, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." God is sick of them. His anger is burning, and you're so appalled by their behavior. It's been a month. It's been just over a month, and already they're back to what they were doing. They just said, we will do everything as the Lord commands them. And now they're back to this. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I have commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it, said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. It's people who buck against the yoke. It's people who don't want to listen to good instruction and to the wise instruction of the Lord, but want to do what they want to contain God into a lifeless statue that they can patrol around wherever they want, to do miracles for them, to be the one going ahead of them, to clear the way to the promised land for them on their time. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation out of you." Now, this is a big deal for Moses. God is offering Moses the chance to be everything that Abraham is. God is offering Moses the chance to be the father of nations. Even at the time of Israel, even at the time of Jesus, everyone still talks about their father Abraham. I mean, we have a song about Father Abraham now. And God gives that opportunity to Moses. But Moses implored the Lord and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people? They've rebelled, but Moses still sees them as God's people. He has a right to them. He's the one who brought them out of slavery. They would still be stuck in Egypt under the yoke of the Egyptians if God had not rescued them from their suffering and their oppression. Why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Moses pleads with God on account of God's name. It's not and his covenant faithfulness, he doesn't try to plead that they're all innocent, that this is all just some big misunderstanding, that the Israelites didn't mean it. But he pleads on the name and reputation of God himself. He knows that God is a faithful God. He knows that God is a just God and a loving God who turns from his anger. Because the name of God is what's really at stake here. These people are actively saying, this is our God. This is Yahweh. This lifeless statue of a bull is what we are choosing to represent the Lord of heaven and earth. What is that? And then, to top it all off, they say, let's get drunk and do all sorts of things in a big party around this bull. What would the Egyptians say if they saw that? What would the Assyrians, the Philistines, any of those, what would they say if they saw a people doing everything just like them? A people who are supposed to be separate and holy to God, acting like a bunch of common drunks. What does that say about who God is? What does that say about the Lord of heaven and earth, that this is what his people are like? Moreover, even if you believe that they are disobeying him, what does it say what does it say about him that they just feel free to disobey him like that? To refuse his loving care and instruction and say, no, we want it our way. When God said they were a special people, what did that mean to them? But in the end, God does relent. He turns aside his anger upon the merits of Moses' mediation for the people. In the end, it is God's covenant faithfulness, his faithfulness to the promises he made to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob that bear them away from that suffering, from their righteous punishment. It is his love that gives grace freely. It's a love that can be given by God as he turns away his anger from our sin, from the Israelite sin. They took the words of God's covenant. They listened to the letter but didn't obey because they distrusted him. They wanted miracles in God on their schedule, not his. They saw the glory. They could still see the glory on the mountain. They were still being provided day by day by the manna and quail from heaven. And they still wanted more. They wanted something like the Red Sea, something big and flashy. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager and wanted that. I remember when I would go on all these youth camps and be like, I want the big flashy stuff. Why don't I have a shiny, bright testimony to tell everyone? And then they tried to fit God into their preconceived box, their traditions, the things they learned back in Egypt of how a God should be worshipped. That a God is just something you can come and pray to when you feel like it, and then just leave it alone for the rest of the week. Now, wanting miracles and feeling doubt and wanting to abide by tradition are not necessarily bad things in and of themselves, but they are when we try to use them to box in God. When we try to say, no, we want you to do this for us. Like, we've got the plans drawn out. You just come, do your thing, and we'll figure out the rest. I mean, there's libraries to be said about the different ways the churches worship God in all these different ways. It's when we try to take the good gifts of God, the blessings he's given us, and make them our own, when we take our own sinful desires, put the label of God's approval on them. How do we know who God is, and how do those around us know who God is? What do they see in us when, if that's the way we treat him? And so we look back to the words of Moses, because our God is one who keeps his promises. Our God is one who loves us. Our God provides and protects us. Our God leads us through the tough times. Our God relents from his anger when we rightly deserve it for everything that we do. He doesn't treat us as we deserve, but he turns his wrath away upon the witness of our high priest, who intercedes for us by putting himself in the breach, who puts himself in the way, so that our names are in that book of life, so that we don't have to taste the judgment of God, and that we can join him in eternity, in the new creation, in that new Eden and full relationship that was promised. Dear Lord, I know that I especially, none of us are perfect. All of us have fallen short. But we thank you that we have the witness of your word to show us where we lose our way, where we fail to love you as we should, to obey you as we should. But more importantly, we thank you that you sent your Son to live his life with us and die as one of us, so that our sin would be covered and that we don't need to fear death because we know the one who's conquered it. In Jesus' name, amen.